Once again, good morning to all the doctors, delegates, and all renowned speakers. I welcome you to AIOC. We are live from Hall Kenmin. And now, for the third session, I would like to invite our chairperson, Dr. K.S. Kumar. I request Dr. K.S. Kumar to proceed. Over to the Dr. K.S. Kumar. Thank you so much, and welcome once again.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this instruction course. Is my slide visible and is my voice audible?
So your slide is not visible. Can you just reshare it once again?
I went to slide share and is it visible now?
Yes, doctor.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this instruction course on diabetic retinopathy for comprehensive ophthalmologists. Upfront, let me make it clear that the elephant in the room really is the uncomfortable truth. And the uncomfortable truth with regard to diabetic retinopathy is the fact that although we are loosely familiar with diabetic retinopathy, many of us would really like to brush up our knowledge about diabetic retinopathy. And this instruction course is intended to provide that particular facility. We have on board very senior vitreoretinal surgeons, Dr. A.S. Guruprasad, Dr. N.S. Murlidhar, Dr. Nitin Prabhudesai, Dr. Mahesh Ji, who will be joining us shortly, Dr. Purna Chandra, and myself. I'll be giving a brief introduction of each one of these as they begin their talk. And the talks have been divided this way. Dr. N.S. Murlidhar will be discussing about NVD, its many phases. I will be discussing on NVE, the overt and the covert. Dr. A.S. Guruprasad will be discussing on diabetic maculopathy, hard exudates, and beyond. Dr. Purna Chandra will be discussing on diabetic retinopathies needing VR intervention. Dr. Mahesh will be discussing how not to miss early diabetic retinopathy and tips for laser treatment in diabetic retinopathy. And last but not the least, Dr. Nitin Prabhudesai will be discussing comorbid retinopathies in diabetic retinopathy. So I will start off the talk for reasons of logistics on NVE, overt, and covert. Now, NVE or neovascularization elsewhere is defined as any neovascularization in the retina arising one disc diameter away from the disc. This is because the neovascularization arising from the disc itself can protrude to an area one disc diameter around the disc. Therefore, anything arising beyond one disc diameter away from the disc is considered as NVE. It may or may not be associated with NVD. The common sites are the posterior pole, post-equatorial retina, and as depicted on the ultra-wide field fluorescein angiogram, even peripheral retina. These are curly, sinuous, somewhat pinkish in color, often associated with fibrous tissue. They may be either loose tufts or they can form a tightly knit nubbin. Now, they can vary, as I said, from monstrous to the minuscule, and diagnosing NVE in pictures such as these are really a no-brainer. But then, when in the early stages, the new vessels form fine, squiggly tufts along the long axis of the vessels, and these are more easily depicted on the fluorescein angiogram, forming these umbel-like neovascular fronts. Now, this is what we should be very careful not to miss in these patients. Clinical examination alone is enough to diagnose many of these patients. So we have to be very cautious and keen with observing the fundus in these patients. Oftentimes, the neovascularization will be associated with some element of fibrous proliferation, a little yellowing, which can be very subtle like here, or a little more prominent as can be seen in the fundus picture to your right. And of course, well-established fibrous proliferation, fibrovascular proliferation as seen in the pictures below. A point to emphasize from the pictures on top is to use the proper illumination and that way not miss neovascularization. The slide here shows as neovascularization that may be easily missed, whereas the same picture to your right-hand side, the neovascular front with better illumination is staring at you. The other point is to use red-free light where the visual noise, because the color of new vessels as well as the background retina is the same, we may be missing subtle neovascularization as here, whereas with the red-free light where the RPE and the melanin reflects the light, whereas the hemoglobin in the blood vessels absorbs light, and therefore these new vessels can show up better on a red-free light. Now we come to the covert NVE. What is covert? Which we may be missing is we really need to hunt the retina or scout the retina or frisking the retina, if you may call it so, to not to miss these vessels. So these may be missed when the media clarity is not good or when they are immature in nature. So we need to look at high density zones in the retina. What are these high density zones? Be careful to look at areas in the vicinity of occluded vessels. You may be able to occluded vessels. You may be able to find new vessels in the vicinity. The other thing is confluent soft exudates or cotton wool spots are areas in the proximity of which we may be able to see new vessels. The other point is yellowing of the retina. These are not really cotton wool spots, but we will come to it a little later as well. Any area of the retina that shows a little yellowish patch, you may have new vessels there, as can be seen in the set of photographs here. If you look at the fundus with an indirect ophthalmoscope, these areas of yellowing will become very prominent. More examples to show the yellow spots with pigmentary disturbances, which usually harbor new vessels. These are thought to be related to excess basement membrane deposits in areas of new vessels. So this is an area of high density. Then areas of venous loop may harbor new vessels as well. Any subtle streak of preretinal hemorrhage we should not be missing, because any preretinal hemorrhage, you can almost always be sure that there is a neovascular front just around the corner. Any patch of blotchy hemorrhage in the mid-periphery or periphery usually is likely to be associated with new vessels. The other important point for beginners is the posterior poles of this patient had absolutely no trace of any diabetic retinopathy, but the mid-peripheral fundus showed fronts of new vessels. So we should, we should take care to examine the fundus as a whole. As a general rule of thumb, more the number of hemorrhages, more likely that the patient will have new vessels. Another area where we may miss out on new vessels that can be depicted more on fluorescein angiogram as compared to color fundus or fundus examination is the situation of astroid hylosis. Then we have patients with cataracts. For preoperative prognostication, many times these fluorescein angiography may show new vessels in these patients, or a patient with early dispersed vitreous hemorrhage. The cause of the vitreous hemorrhage may be better picked up on a fluorescein angiogram as new vessels. Now, we have many situations where patients are lasered, which may be either complete or partial, and within these areas of lasered retina, we may be able to see these new vessels, but certain situations we may not be able to see them as grossly as we did in the previous set of photographs, and many times these are picked up on a fluorescein angiogram. So residual NME is still active in partially treated lasers or other situations which we should be wary about. Myopics may not always be immune to the development of proliferative diabetic retinopathy, and if the patient has associated nephropathy or a lot of hemorrhages in the fundus, we may have to seek recourse to a FFA in these patients. This is a rare situation of a neovascular front right at the fovea, as depicted on this multicolor imaging, the OCT and the corresponding FFA as well. So the pitfalls in the diagnosis of NVE, they may be present with even apparently, I put normal looking in inverted commas, seemingly normal fundus. Look for areas of confluent soft exudates, occluded vessels or blotchy hemorrhages, any pigment mottling or sites of ERMA that were previously noted in the patient's files, yellowish white reflexes in the retina, and astroid hylosis. So employ a combination of both indirect for the panoramic view, as well as greater stereopsis and resolution of the slit lamp biomicroscopy. Have a pattern, a regular pattern, so as not to miss any lesions or have skipped lesions in between. You may use the fundus, color fundus photograph with overlapping fields as well to detect these new vessels. So NVE on the ultra wide field angiogram may yield a higher presence of NVE. There are some newer techniques called vessel extraction techniques from images. Post-acquisition image processing can detect new vessels as well. This is just for the purposes of discussion. And as we alluded to already, near infrared reflectance images may also yield a higher yield of NVE. Thank you very much for your patient hearing. We now go on to the next presentation by Dr. N.S. Muralidhar, my good friend. A brief introduction to Dr. N.S. Muralidhar. He did his training from Bangalore Medical College and then subsequently from the prestigious RP Center for Ophthalmic Sciences. He proceeded to Sydney for a fellowship in Vitreoretina, and after returning, I might say that he is the Bhishma Pitamaha, although he doesn't like this. He is the Bhishma Pitamaha of retina in Bangalore and Karnataka. He was the one who really started retina work to begin with. He has since published several papers, taken part in international and national conferences, and currently heads the Retina Institute of Karnataka in Bangalore. He's a dear friend of mine. Over to you, Dr. Muralidhar, for your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar, for including me in this symposium. Am I audible and my slides are visible, I suppose? We'll go ahead.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk about the many phases of NVD in PDR. Dr. Kumar has a penchant for, conceptualizing very different kind of instruction courses, and this is one of them. And I was quite flummoxed when I was given this topic, but I hope I have been able to do justice to the topic. Now, NVD in PDR, why is it important? Because we all know that NVD is an important component of high-risk PDR. We all know that there is a risk of severe visual loss with a patient has a high-risk PDR and you don't treat them promptly with laser. So therefore, it's important that we do not miss NVD in a patient with diabetic retinopathy. Essentially, finding NVD is a clinical skill, that is picked up on diligent clinical examination. As Dr. Kumar has already emphasized, indirect ophthalmoscopy is an important tool in overall examination of the retina, but might not be a best way to pick up NVD because we can easily miss the fine new vessels on the disc. Slit lamp biomicroscopy is the best way to pick up, NVDs in all our patients with diabetic retinopathy. And this is what I would recommend that we do in all our patients to really pick up these NVDs and also NVEs in all our patients with diabetic retinopathy. Whenever new vessels are there like this, it's not a big problem to diagnose. I think anybody will be able to pick up these arborescent new vessels on the disc here and elsewhere. The raised new vessels like this on the disc and extensive new vessels here. So new vessels like this are very easy to pick up and not generally missed. However, clinically, we may not be able to have patients like this in all situations. We have patients who have very subtle changes on the disc. You can see here 4 examples of subtle new vessels. So in the second example, you can see that the natural pallor of the cup is obscured, and you can see that that could be an indication for presence of new vessels. And the pallor of the disc here and new vessels along the arcades, along the major vessels. So sometimes you may have to spend more time looking at these eyes in order not to miss these early new vessels. So when do you suspect PDR? I think Dr. Kumar has alluded to this. Any pre-retinal hemorrhage is by definition a PDR in a patient with DR, and we must make all efforts to see new vessels elsewhere or new vessels on the disc. Presence of any old or fresh vitreous hemorrhage again is an indication of PDR. They've seen NVEs in multiple areas. Spend some time looking at the disc to pick up any NVD and gliosis along the arcades. I think Kumar has really shown you many examples of NVE and how they look at various stages. Let me not spend much time on that. This is what I was talking about. A patient on routine examination comes with a pre-retinal hemorrhage here, pre-retinal hemorrhage here. So why I am stressing on pre-retinal hemorrhage is
some background noise is there. Please mute others. Please mute yourself, please.
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, Murali.
Okay. Pre-retinal hemorrhage is an important sign of PDR. Why I'm stressing on this is we get referrals from our colleagues and patient has a pre-retinal hemorrhage and the patient is referred to us as a patient of NPDR or BDR. So that means the significance of pre-retinal hemorrhage has been missed in that particular eye. So any sign of pre-retinal hemorrhage, please look for PDR in these eyes. Now, another subtle sign that we see is sometimes condensation of vitreous and a gliosis on the disc. Sometimes it is very subtle, and this could be an early sign of PDR and a new vessel on the disc. Now, sometimes the new vessels on the disc are not so visible, but they're extending along the arcades, and you can see that they are, along the arcades, they are quite vascular and raised. And this also classifies as an NVD, because as Kumar said, any new vessel within 1 disc diameter, although this is more than 1 disc diameter, it's part of a neovascular complex within the disc. ILM folds are an important pointer to the presence of some traction and gliosis, and could be a pointer for presence of PVD in these eyes. Now, if you look cursorily on this eye, you may easily miss the presence of a new vessel. But when you increase the magnification of the slit lamp and then see, there is a fine network of new vessels on the disc that you can see. So it is important to examine the disc with a little bit more magnification than what you normally use, in order not to miss these fine arborizing new vessels that can be picked up on magnified view. So what are the tips I can give you to confirm or pick up these new vessels? One is use high magnification, as I've shown you in the previous example. One of the things that we don't use so much is a red free light. That's a green filter that is available in the slit lamp. In all our slit lamps, this is available, and putting this red free light can enhance the vascular pathologies and make the vessels appear much more brightly and easy to pick up. So use the red free light whenever you are doing 90D lens examination in a patient. Of course, in any patient in whom you want to document, you want to confirm the presence, and clinically it is not possible to be very sure. FFA is the gold standard to confirm the presence of new vessels. And nowadays we have started using OCTA, especially of the disc, in order to pick up new vessels on the disc. As Kumar said, the new vessels can be found on the nasal side, above the arcades, below the arcades, and temporal to the fovea. These are situations where OCTA is difficult, but OCTA of the disc is easily done. And we have used this in clinical situations where we suspected the presence of NVD. This is, of course, if you look at clinically, the NVD in this eye is not very obvious. But however, when you do the fluorescein angiogram, you see the leakage from new vessels on the disc, and also there is another NVE along the inferior arcade. So FFA is the gold standard. And now we look at this eye. This eye looks also non-discrete, but when we look at the OCTA, you are able to demonstrate the arborescent new vessel on the disc, that is seen in this eye. Another example where the new vessels on the disc were not very obvious, but OCTA clearly showed the raised new vessels on the disc. Just a few more slides. Asteroid hyalosis is another situation where you may need to do a fluorescein in order to confirm. And once we have NVEs present at multiple sites, there is no need to do an FFA in this eye. Hyperemic swollen disc and collaterals on the disc are two clinical situations where you might really feel a problem in distinguishing from NVD. The dilated vessels are never raised from the surface. They're always within the surface of the retina. And fluorescein angiogram can easily show the dilated capillaries on the disc. So collaterals, on the other hand, have a larger caliber. They have a corkscrew-like appearance. There is no branching. They are not raised, and there is no leakage on FFA. As you can see in this FFA, there is no leakage by the collaterals. So in conclusion, new vessels on the disc is an important component of PDR that should not be missed. A diligent examination using high magnification is required in all the eyes. FFA and OCTA can confirm, and overall you have to correlate with the overall clinical picture and arrive at the final diagnosis. I thank Kumar for lending some of the pictures shown in this lecture, and thank you all for patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muralidhar, for a really exhaustive and succinct discussion on neovascularization of the disc. That was a very important facet of our instruction course today. I now have the pleasure of welcoming another dear friend of mine, Dr. A.S. Guruprasad. He did his MBBS from the Bangalore Medical College and his post-graduation from Hubli. And then he did a Vitreoretina fellowship from Shankar Nethralaya. And after that, he has made Hubli his home. And he is no newcomer to any one of us in the ophthalmic fraternity. He has the distinction of, as Murli said, he is arguably the highest volume surgeon among anybody in our state. And he has presented several papers and has had honors from the American Academy of Ophthalmology. He has even won the Rhett Buckler Award a couple of occasions. is no newcomer. I have great pleasure in welcoming Dr. A.S. Guruprasad for his next talk on hard exudates and beyond. Dr. Guruprasad, for Needful, please.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Am I heard?
Sure.
Is it better than the previous IC? I hope.
Better.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Kumar, for the kind introduction and also for having me in this IC. So I'll be speaking on diabetic maculopathy, hard exudates and beyond, as given the topic given by Dr. Kumar. Is anybody going to speak about the elephant in the room? I was wondering if anybody would use that word at all. Anyway, I'm going to use it. No financial disclosures. So diabetic macular edema is one aspect. It is a narrower terminology compared to diabetic maculopathy, which encompasses, um, one second, yeah, which encompasses both diabetic macular edema and traction leading to edema and anatomical changes in the macula. So this is my favorite slide, a schematic which shows how capillaries and microaneurysms can leak because of damage to the pericytes, intramural pericytes, and causing leakage of fluid and lipoproteinaceous material, causing swelling of the retina and hard exudation. And until 2001, we had only slit lamp biomicroscopy with 90D or 78D at our disposal to examine the macula for any thickening, and that was only possible by experienced ophthalmologists. But today we have the optical coherence tomography, which can pick up the macular edema, even the subtle ones. We can pick up with quantification as well. So yellow regions at the macula can mimic DME. We all know that. So how do we approach DME and not miss the elephant in the room? Are these hard exudates? Let us start with a simple picture. Are they drusen? Yes, they are drusen. They are actually reticular pseudodrusen, and these have been referred to as hard exudates due to diabetic macular edema. And how about this? Are they hard exudates? Yes, they are not hard exudates, although there are a few. This is a diabetic patient with some hemorrhage. You can see here, there may be a few hard exudates which can probably be picked up on OCT or FFA. But there is definitely a picture of drusen. You can see that the dull color of the yellowish spots is, and the deeper plane probably makes it more in favor of a colloidal bodies. Sorry, this is not moving. Yeah. How about this? This looks like this has also been referred to us as diabetic macular edema or diabetic maculopathy, and you can see that the hard exudates here are quite extensive in the left eye, which progressed to become like this. Actually, this is a case of CNVM or possibly as PCV, and we should be able to distinguish that. This was referred to us as a cercinate, but what was missed by the referring surgeon was the subretinal hemorrhage. So we have to look at the pictures which mimic hard exudates, mimic diabetic macular edema, mimics a cercinate, and because we have to rule out in such cases subretinal hemorrhage and the dull and powdery hard exudates that I like to distinguish them from the other type of exudates. This type of exudate is typical of PCV. Adult onset Coats disease, a lot of microvascular and macrovascular changes here and here with a lot of exudation at the posterior pole. Coats nodule in an adult is another confusing picture which can be mimicking a hard exudate due to diabetic maculopathy. RAP is another exudation from a retinal artery macroaneurysm. And this is something that I like the most, something that is so much resembling diabetic macular edema. He's a diabetic patient. He has this, and this has been this. Even I would probably diagnose as a case of diabetic macular edema. But what we are missing here is a blocked tributary vein, which has led to this. And tributary vein occlusion is one of the closest mimicker of diabetic macular edema. So coming to edema in diabetics. Macular edema in a diabetic patient, is it really DME or is it macular edema in a diabetic? This is an example. Pseudophakic Irwin gas syndrome in a diabetic patient can mimic diabetic macular edema. So we have to be wary of this and try to rule out, and there are several points in to distinguish between the two. Coming to diabetic macular edema per se, ETDRS definition of DME, I think everyone is familiar in this hall, and I don't think I have to go into the details. It just quantifies or tells us about the location of the macular edema and the hard exudates. There's another international clinical DME disease severity scale, which again is clinical, just like CSME, where the distance of the hard exudates from the center of the macula is what determines whether it is mild, moderate, or severe. We know that we have diagnostic tools today of fundus photography, optical coherence tomography, and fluorescein angiography at our disposal to diagnose diabetic macular edema, the most important of which is today perhaps optical coherence tomography. So classification that helps this, which helps decide the therapy is the number one is non-center involving edema, as in this picture, and the other is center involving edema. And this is what helps us differentiate whether we have to treat this patient or watch. OCT classification, I'll not go into the details. This is just listed out there. So VEGF is an important mediator in the pathogenesis of DME. We know that, but it is not only VEGF. Retinal disease has multifactorial pathophysiology, and we know that there is inflammation, vascular leakage, and neovascularization causing retinal disease, and diabetic macular edema is no exception. There is a substantial contribution of, is my time up? There's a substantial contribution of inflammation in the causation of diabetic macular edema. So this is an algorithm which I formed for the treatment of diabetic macular edema. Divide it into tractional and non-tractional, and if it is tractional, then surgery is the answer. This is a case of tractional diabetic macular edema, which has a substantial tractional component. You can see the thick ERM causing focal traction at places on the inner retinal surface. And this is a gross traction, which is in a case of PDR. We're talking about diabetic maculopathy. Therefore, I took the liberty of including this in this picture, in this presentation. The left eye of this patient has severe proliferation, causing a picture like this total distortion of the macular area, with the fovea not much being involved, but the perifocal area is actually detached. So this patient underwent surgery and there was good resolution, and the patient had good recovery of vision. Coming to the non-tractional, we have focal, diffuse, we have center involving, non-center involving, and we have for the non-center involving, we have the ETDRS laser or the subthreshold micropulse laser, with which I have some experience and I've used it in selected cases. But as time is passing by, we are using less and less laser. But most importantly, we are using pharmacotherapy, and I'll just come to that. So laser is something that we use very rarely. Surgery is what we use for traction. So what you're left with is steroids and anti-VEGF drugs. And this is what we have in our armamentarium today. Bevacizumab, ranibizumab, aflibercept or VEGF trap, and Dex implant. So let us come to some case examples. A 50-year-old with diabetic macular who's diabetic since 6 years, and who has a 6/18 vision and 1/60 vision in the left eye, respectively. And this is the clinical picture, and this is the OCT. So he was treated with bevacizumab in both the eyes on this particular day. He comes back 2 months later, has this picture, which is actually resolved in the left eye, but not so much in the right eye. Dr. Kumar, am I running out of time? Are we running out of time?
But you can try and finish.
Yes, sir. Sorry to interrupt, but actually the time is up. But it's okay. You can sum up within the next 30 seconds.
What is the time? Actually, it's 8 minutes and 38 seconds. I thought I had 10 minutes.
No, sir. 8 minutes for presentation and 1 minute.
Okay. So I'll have to probably skip these cases.
Please sum it up. Yeah.
Go ahead, Guru. Finish.
Yeah.
No
So another patient who was treated with aflibercept, 1 month follow-up. This is the picture. This is, mind you, a patient with poor vision, and this is the post-injection picture. Treated with ranibizumab later because the patient could not afford aflibercept, and then he came back with improvement and was motivated for taking more injections. And this is the injection that was given after 2 months follow-up. 6 weeks post Ozurdex, this was the picture, and patient was very happy with 6/9 vision. So what we must consider is patient compliance, whether the patient is able to come or not for follow-up. And the initial visual acuity to choose the drug is another factor that we would like to consider, because this patient had poor vision and aflibercept probably works better. So had this patient had COVID and came 6 months later post unlock, and this is what the patient had. He had patient had florid NVI in both the eyes. So although there were teleconsultation, there was a teleconsultation session in between, it has its own limitations. And questions to be answered is, DEX is probably best avoided in severe NPDR. Do anti-VEGFs cause more ischemia and NVI as a result of that? And any relation to COVID is something that I would like to have the panelists' opinion on when we finish this presentation. So this is another patient, mixed retinopathy, maybe a CRVO component. You can see the dilated vessels. And this is the story of this patient who had multiple injections, even a PRP in between for PDR changes. And 7 weeks later, the patient, this is actually 14 months later, the patient has actually good resolution of the diabetic macular edema and is maintained well on pharmacotherapy. So what I want you to notice here is that the hard exudates have disappeared in the after 1.5 years. So lessons and observations from this is that be wary of coexisting vascular diseases. For example, a CRVO in this patient, don't overlook background changes, treat the PDR whenever it occurs. Persisting with the treatment helps, and hard exudates can resolve over time with treatment of DME. So this is what I'm trying to reiterate what Kumar said. Don't just look at the posterior pole and the OCT, look at the peripheral fundus. You can have the elephant in the room, the large NV front. So I think I will skip these and go to my conclusion slide, because yeah, this is something that I would like to definitely tell. Recalcitrant non-responding macular edema, how to approach. So there are some biomarkers. We have discussed this in the previous the OCT biomarkers have been identified, which can be used as a guide to treatment, and they include this hard exudate, the hyperreflective spots, the drill, EZ disruption, neurosensory detachment, and so on. And this is probably an indication that there is an inflammatory process going on. Ultra wide field angiography in DME, ischemic index is high, so do targeted laser treatment, and that will take care of the macular edema as well. This is something which I will probably skip. So in summary, I would say identify the type of diabetic macular edema, whether it is tractional or non-tractional. Identify what is driving the edema by use of the inflammatory biomarkers and other clinical evidence, VEGF versus inflammation, and be aware of OCT biomarkers. Stage the background retinopathy to choose the pharmacotherapy. I always follow this. If the patient is closer to severe NPDR or PDR, I would switch to NPDR, I would switch to anti-VEGF if I'm already giving this patient with steroids. Be aware that DME could be a peripheral disease. So peripheral treatment with the targeted laser photocoagulation is something that I would like to treat with for patients with recalcitrant diabetic macular edema, and we should have a low threshold for switching drugs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guru Prasad, for that really exhaustive coverage. That was a job very well done, because it had to cover the whole gamut of not only diabetic macular edema, but also the lookalikes and their management. A job very well done. Excellent, Dr. Guru Prasad. I now have the pleasure of welcoming on board our young
Kumar, it is actually, the time is 10 minutes. I am telling them, audiovisual people cannot. The time is 10 minutes for 6 talks and 25 minutes for
15 minutes for discussion.
Yeah, it is from 11:30 to 12:55, not 8 minutes.
Exactly.
Please, audiovisual people, please note. Okay, it is not 8 minutes. It is printed as 10 minutes for each talk. 6 talks, 60 minutes.
Thank you,
okay.
Mahesh.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yes, actually, we divided the time. Sorry.
No, you don't divide. You don't divide. We prepare based on the time given in the brochure or the directory. So we are prepared for 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
It will not overshoot. That we are promising. Right.
Thank you very much, Mahesh, for that clarification. That was very important, so that we don't hurry up. Dr. Purna Chandra is a dear friend of mine. He's currently in Narayan Nethralaya. He completed his post-graduation from the prestigious Armed Forces Medical College, followed by long-term fellowship in VR at Narayan Nethralaya. He has had stints at the Moorfields Eye Hospital in electrophysiology and inherited retinal disorders, and also worked at the Save Sight Institute in Sydney. He has several international, national publications to his credit. He currently does cutting-edge research in inherited diseases of the retina, and of course also does clinical vitreoretinal work. Dr. Purna Chandra, with great pleasure, we welcome you to deliver your next talk on, you see, many situations we treat with anti-VEGFs or lasers, etc. And we tend to hang on to patients, but it's important to recognize the situations when the patients would need vitreoretinal intervention. So if you are not doing vitreoretinal work and doing only medical retina, it's vitally important to recognize these patterns in the fundus and refer them for appropriate timely vitreoretinal intervention. Dr. Purnachandra will discuss this.
So thank you so much, Kumar sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Is my slide seen in full screen mode?
Fine. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Kumar sir, for including me in the IC. I think all of you, the previous speakers, has made my job very easy so that I can directly go to the surgical aspect of it. So we know like there are a lot of general ophthalmologists and the postgraduates who are watching this through the, of course, audience link. We can't see them. So when to operate in diabetic retinopathy? So these are the 5 headings in which I will be discussing my presentation: in a non-resolving vitreous hemorrhage, macula involving the tractional retinal detachment, combined retinal detachment, and if there is a dense osteodylosis. Any other conditions, I'll just try to cover. Coming to the vitreous hemorrhage. So whenever you see a vitreous hemorrhage in a diabetic patient, what you should do? So first thing is rule out, is there a retinal detachment? Okay, if there is no retinal detachment, there are multiple factors on which the further treatment is decided. For example, depends on the media clarity, what's the fellow eye status, duration of this vitreous hemorrhage, is there any anterior segment neovascularization like NVI and NVA, and occupational requirement of the patient. So we decide to observe if there is a fresh vitreous hemorrhage, if there is no anterior segment neovascularization, and B scan, if we see the retina is attached and fellow has a good vision. But you need to call for follow-up this patient, because this hemorrhage is different than the hemorrhage you get in trauma or a non-diabetic patient. So during the observation period, you can ask them to keep the head end elevated. You can ask them not to strain. You can give oral vitamin C and monitor closely. That is very important. You should not get lost for follow-up. So intravitreal anti-VEGF do play a role in these cases by regressing the new blood vessels, which prevents further bleeding, and also it improves media clarity for laser treatment. And you should remember this effect is temporary, and caution should be given. If there is any fractional retinal detachment, it may worsen. I will show you a case example later. And we can pre-operative also decreases the risk of intraoperative bleeding. It makes dissection bit easier. So vitrectomy in vitreous hemorrhage is indicated if the vitreous hemorrhage, if there is an associated retinal detachment, there is no doubt we have to go in. If there is a vitreous hemorrhage with hemolytic glaucoma or a ghostal glaucoma, bilateral vitreous hemorrhage, long-standing vitreous hemorrhage, if there is one-eyed with dense vitreous hemorrhage, and for occupational requirements. So I'm mentioning occupational requirements again because I have that army background, because especially people who have this require binocularity for their vision, they require, maybe you may have to be a bit aggressive in going for vitrectomy in these cases. So after vitrectomy, for example, you have referred a patient to the VR surgeon and he has come back to you for follow-up. So, and there is a rebleed, and vitrectomy is done, you are following it up post-vitrectomy. There are 30% chances there could be a rebleeding after vitrectomy, which could be an persistent or early if it is less than 4 weeks, which can happen because of the dispersed blood from the peripheral vitreous cut, or maybe oozing from the end of the cut blood vessels, or could be an iatrogenic injury during the surgery, or hypotonic could be a risk factor for the rebleed. And this usually clears spontaneously or may require fluid air exchange with vitreous lavage. So during this, it's very important to monitor the intraocular pressure and any signs of anterior segment neovascularization. For a late or recurrent postoperative vitreous hemorrhage, there will be fibrovascular ingrowth at the site. That could be the cause. There could be an anterior highlight proliferation. There could be traction and residual neovascularization, and there could be recurrent neovascularization. In these cases, better to give an anti-VEGF than do a lavage. Basically, we are trying to bring down the load of VEGF by giving anti-VEGF, then go for the vitreous lavage and add laser. And sometimes you may have to inject silicone oil also. Now, let's go to the case example. So this was a 65-year-old male who presented diminution of vision in left eye since 3 weeks. And BCVA was fairly okay. It was 6.6 and 6.9. And he had right eye PDA. And this is the left eye image in which he had vitreous hemorrhage along with the subretinal hemorrhage. You can see this, though there is vitreous hemorrhage, there is a lot of fundus still visible, where you can definitely go for the laser. That's exactly what we did in this patient. 2 sittings of PRP was done, which was nicely done. We advised dead end elevation and we followed up the patient. So, but 6 months later, the patient came back with vitreous hemorrhage and vision had fallen down to 660. And also there were some tractions which are identified on the B scan. We went ahead and did vitrectomy and patient regained his vision 6.9. If this patient had not been laser, definitely the course would not have been the same. It would have been a completely different course with a very severe TRD, crumpling of the posterior pole of the retina, the dissection along the arcade becomes difficult. All those factors will happen, will be there. So always better to laser. I always believe in lasering. So 4 months post vitrectomy, again developed recurrent vitreous hemorrhage. The story doesn't end there. You need to follow up. Again, we have to do a vitreous lavage with additional laser, and after that is stabilized. And it's almost we have a 2 years of follow up with no recurrence of bleeding. So this is again a 61-year-old male, diabetic since 15 years. He came with a diminution of vision in since 6 months. If you see this fundus photo, it's very obvious. It's a very advanced high-risk proliferative diabetic retinopathy with fibrovascular proliferation on the disc and also along the arcades. And if you see along the superior arcade, there is a demarcation line here. Okay, there is a retinal detachment also in this case. It just looks like a tractional retinal detachment, definitely. But whenever there is a more SRF like this, there could be a micro breaks also. And we did OCT in this patient, and this is how it looked. If you look at, there is a broad vitreomacular traction along with papillary traction. There is a traction and the disc also, which can affect papillomacular bundle. So in these cases, we have to go in for the vitrectomy. There is no point in waiting in these cases. It's only going to get worse. Before going, there are some visible areas. We can do an visible PRP and we have to plan vitrectomy maybe in a week or two. So that's what we did. So this is post surgery. This is an oil filled eye. So there are this is the first post-op day. There are areas of resolving the hemorrhages clots, which will resolve on its own once you remove all the highlight. The second case was third case was 55-year-old male who was diabetic since 20 years, was on dialysis, and past history of retinal laser was there, and he presented with diminution of vision. So this was again a very well lasered retina. We can see there's a diffuse subhyaloid hemorrhage along with some amount of fibrovascular proliferation seen inferiorly. So in these cases, it's safe to wait. The other option could be you can do an ag hyaloidotomy. Or if there's whatever the indications I chosen, if it is a long standing, if for occupational requirement, for any other reason, you can go for the vitrectomy in these cases. So one more thing which always we are surgeons or any retina specialists don't like is astrodialosis. Dense astrodialosis, it makes it difficult to laser the patient. So the chances of disease progression are very high. You can do the laser. I'm not telling you can't. Again, depends on the degree and density of the astrodialosis. You can do a fair amount of laser, but complete may not be possible all the time, especially in these kind of dense astrodialosis, where it's better to do a vitrectomy and then or intraoperative laser you can do, and post-operatively the monitoring will also be better. So then coming to the last case of combined retinal detachment, this was a 51-year-old male who came with complaints of decreased vision in the right eye since 1 month. And there was known case of uncontrolled diabetes since 10 years on oral hypoglycemic agent. And he has taken 1 dose of anti-VEGF injection in the right eye elsewhere. We don't have the pre-injection photograph. And this is how he presented to us. So this anti-VEGF, he had a basically high risk. There is a science to suggest that there has a high risk proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Anti-VEGF has aggravated the traction and resulted in a formation of rhegma, or could be this thing. It has led to combined retinal detachment. It's almost assuming like a closed funnel configuration over here, and with multiple NVs over here and all. So in these cases, there is no second thought. We have to go in, operate, and better to inject silicone oil in these cases. So coming to the pattern of DME, the Guru Professor has already described. I'm going to tell those category in which surgical intervention may be required. So it can be divided into 5 stages, the pattern of DME based on the OCT. I'll just describe one by one. The first is a diffuse or sponge-like macular edema in which a focal laser intravitreal injection should be enough. Second grade is cystoid macular edema. In grade 3, along with cystoid changes, there will be neurosensory detachment. Up to grade 3, you can do a medical line of management. In grade 4, what happens is there will be taut posterior hyaloid with traction. In these cases, your medical line won't work. We have to go in. This is a mechanical pull. We need to do a vitrectomy and release this. And this is the pre-op from post-op week. In grade 5, what happens? Along with the traction, there will be small amount of traction, neurosensory detachment also. In this case also, this is a mechanical phenomena. Unless you go in, trim off all these membranes, it won't help. You have to do a vitrectomy in these cases. There's no point in waiting in these cases. These cases requires early referral to a VR surgeon. Coming to the vitreomacular traction, it can be two types. We call it as focal vitreomacular traction if it is less than 1500 microns, and broad if it is 1500, if it's more than 1500 microns. Why we need to classify is, again, whenever we classify, we need to ask ourselves, why are we classifying? Even for the macular edema, I told. So less than 500 focal VMT, the patients will be more symptomatic, but there are chances that it may release spontaneously. Whereas in case of broad VMT, it is unlikely. So we need to, maybe they require a vitrectomy at an earlier stage. Okay. So I will just show one surgical video of a tractional retinal detachment with vitreous hemorrhage.
Please continue.
Yeah, I can continue now, sir. Just 1 minute, sir. I'll finish. Okay. So first we clear the vitreous hemorrhage. Okay. So once vitreous hemorrhage is clear, we dissect out all the membranes. In this patient, the culprit was this flaw, dry polyp, which is nasal to the disc, which has elevated this island of retina and is gradually encroaching the macula also. And these things needs to be dissected out with extra caution, because if you can observe, the underlying retina also appears atrophic. So that's why what I have done is I have just isolated, I have trimmed off all its connection. Now I'm approaching the actual membrane. So it's better not to pull this membrane. It can cause iatrogenic breaks. And while dissecting, better once you find the plane, it becomes easy, and we can go on dissecting by segmentation, delamination, all those permutation combinations you can use. But you have to be, especially this case I took example because underlying retina is atrophic, and this is quite a long standing. And patient was not that symptomatic because it was nasal. Patient became symptomatic when the SRF started spreading to the macula. So this was dissected off completely. There could be an hemorrhage while dissection. We need to, judicious hemostasis is very important. But most of the time, once you remove all the membrane, this bleeding will stop. Especially at the disc, we need to be a bit careful when we are removing. As I told, better not to pull. In these cases, I prefer trimming it. Sometimes it comes off completely. Even if it doesn't come off completely, if you just trim and leave the stump, nothing will happen. So although this case, it came off completely. So if it's not possible by the cutter, sometimes you may have to this. This is a controversial area. Some prefer not to remove this FEP over the disc because of the risk of bleeding, and some prefer removing it. I remove it because I believe unless there is no trauma to the retinal vessels, if you look at the anatomy, the way hyaloid gets attached in the prepapillary area, it is slightly different. Okay, most of the time it's the FEP which bleeds rather than the retinal blood vessel bleeding, and these wounds most of the time it will stop. We can discuss and debate on this later. So I can see that this is blood clot. That clot I will not remove. I'll just leave it at the disc, which will get absorbed on its own. And we'll do an endo laser followed by tamponading silicone oil or gas or whatever. In this case, I injected silicone oil. To conclude, I would like to say, I always press on the medical management. Don't see diabetic retinopathy in isolation. Look at the systemic parameter. Make sure that all is HbA1c, lipid profile, all its metabolic parameters are correct. A prompt laser and the judicious use of anti-VEGF, which I've described, and timely referral to VR surgeon will go a long way in saving this vision in this preventable blindness. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Over to you, Kumar sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Purnachandra. That was a very, very exhaustive coverage, compendium of vitreoretinal interventions in PDR. So the object of this instruction course was basically for comprehensive ophthalmologists. And why we included this talk here is not so much as to show off our vitreoretinal skills, as much as to recognize the situations or patterns at which stage a vitreoretinal intervention is required. So many times we see several patients who are being continued to be treated with a homeopathic dose of laser, an odd intravitreal injection here and there, when the patient actually needs a quick vitreoretinal intervention. So it is to recognize these patterns, and Dr. Purna has shown these patterns very clearly. Thank you so much for that. I now have great pleasure in introducing Dr. G. Mahesh, a very good friend of mine again. He did his fellowship in vitreoretinal diseases from Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai, and is currently working at the Giridhar Eye Institute. He has umpteen presentations in national, international, and state fora. He has several publications. A man gifted with an academic bent of mind, a no-nonsense, straightforward person. I invite Dr. Mahesh to deliver his talk on a very important aspect about how not to miss early treatable diabetic retinopathy and tips for laser treatment. Now, many may consider that laser treatment is a virtual non-entity. It is not so. Laser still has its pride of place in proliferative forms of diabetic retinopathy. Dr. Mahesh, please, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar, to be part of your course again. And nice to be with very senior people like Guru Prasad sir and Muralidhar sir. So I have changed the title little. Instead of not to miss early diabetic retinopathy, even if you miss early diabetic retinopathy, it may be okay for a few months. But treatable diabetic retinopathy is important. So you have to look for diabetic retinopathy, then you will not miss. That is the first thing. Many times people don't even look for the diabetic retinopathy in a diabetic case. So that is why many people are missing. And in the over last 2 decades, we have seen a lot of patients, referral patients. The patients will be referred only if there is a frank PDR. And usually DME will be picked up very easily because they do, many people do direct ophthalmoscopy. DME will be picked up very easily, but frank PDR or only will be referred. So that is the thing that is worrying for us because we get very bad cases at the late stage. You can err in the diagnosis of mild, moderate or moderate to severe to some extent, but should not miss an NV or a PDR at the earliest. And DME is less likely to be missed in these cases. So what we miss is very subtle changes. No diabetic retinopathy, some diabetic retinopathy, few microaneurysms. If you do a good slit lamp biomicroscopy, it is absolutely fine. You will pick up. Small NV in presumed NPDR. We may think NPDR, but it may be a NV. Peripheral changes, many of us miss because we don't do an indirect ophthalmoscopy. This is mainly, I'm talking for the comprehensive ophthalmologist. And don't forget the vision loss out of proportion to the clinical findings. There will be something in the macula. So none of us or none of the general ophthalmologists miss this sort of finding, even with the direct ophthalmoscopy, because DME is visible very easily with the ophthalmoscope. But already Muralidhar sir told, when you see a small preretinal hemorrhage, and many are referred as NPDR, a small preretinal hemorrhage always tells you that there is a underlying NVE. So like this, here you can see that there is a small hemorrhage, preretinal hemorrhage. It is not NPDR, it is PDR. And then if you see the lower picture, there is an altered blood preretinal hemorrhage. It is also PDR. These are usually referred as NPDR, and the treatment is delayed for many months. This is another case. If you look at the posterior pole only, it looks like few NPDR changes. But that upper temporally, there is a fibrovascular proliferation. And in fact, direct ophthalmoscopy examination is likely to miss 40% of eyes with treatable retinopathy. Very important. So, and fibrous tissue always means there is proliferative diabetic retinopathy. These white tissues and traction in the retina and all. So, these are some of the clues. And when vision loss is out of proportion, already it's mentioned, there could be an ischemic macula or a vitreomacular traction. You have to investigate with OCT and fluorescein angiogram whenever necessary. So this is another unexplained visual loss. There is a traction with the macula, diffuse VMD. Peripheral changes are missed very often because many people don't do indirect ophthalmoscopy judiciously. Here we can see many new vessels are in the extreme periphery, not in the posterior pole. Even though diabetes is a disease of the posterior pole, here most of the new vessels are in the periphery. So a fluorescein angiogram is showing nicely how peripheral this can go. And another thing that I have to tell comprehensive ophthalmologists, even if it is moderate NPDR, they progress to PDR. 1/3 of them progress to PDR within 1 year if the metabolic control is quite bad. And this is very bad in severe NPDR. They progress to PDR, half of them progress to PDR in 1 year. So if you feel that there is a severe NPDR, it is always better to have a retina specialist opinion and probably do a fluorescein angiogram to confirm. This is another case. The peripheral, the new vessels and IRMA is there in the periphery, which many people miss because they look only at the posterior pole. Another severe NPDR. These are all cases which has to be seen and necessarily done fluorescein angiogram to rule out any NV. What happens is many times we go with the vision. 6x6. You just see this picture with NVD. It's 6x6. So don't ever go by the vision. Vision is 6x6. Don't think that patient is okay. You have to dilate and see. This is a bomb in the eye. So how do we see all these things? You can use a direct ophthalmoscope. If you are not at all trained, you can use indirect ophthalmoscope best with slit lamp biomicroscopy. And if still possible, you can have a commercially available camera, handheld, or up to Optos, or do it yourself fundus camera. Direct ophthalmoscopy is not good, but better than nothing. At least you can pick up the changes in the posterior pole. This picture is very important. If you see the direct ophthalmoscope visualization, that disc, the blue circle is the direct ophthalmoscope field of vision. Just see how much we are missing. 99% of the retina we are missing using direct ophthalmoscope. So ideally, you should use, this is another wide field picture, how much we are missing with direct you can see. So ideal method for screening is indirect ophthalmoscope and slit lamp biomicroscope. So this is the ideal method. If possible, that is the best method and cheapest method. So the slit lamp biomicroscope you can ask the patient to look up and down and see up to equator with very high magnification, 3-dimensional view, and you will not miss any new vessels in the posterior pole. And we usually do international clinical diabetic retinopathy severity scale classification. So if you see some neovascularization or pre-retinal hemorrhage, it is PDR. And if it is more than 20 retinal hemorrhages all around, make sure it is not PDR and severe end PDR. DME, I have already told, it is unlikely to miss. So fundus photography is a simple method of documenting, and this can be done with different fundus cameras available. And now people are using smartphones, very cheap, and little adapter in the do-it-yourself cameras are available. This is developed by my friend Dr. Biju Raju, and you can use it with indirect ophthalmoscope and even slit lamp so that you can get a nice photograph if you want to document the findings. Slit lamp adapters are there. And then there are a lot of not so expensive handheld non-metallic camera for screening diabetic retinopathy. Different companies, I don't have any financial. And finally, the end spectrum is Optos. If your purse is very heavy, you can think about Optos. So fundus camera documentation is one simple method so that you don't miss anything. So now coming back to the second part of my talk, I give a few tips on the laser treatment. Now we do laser in diabetic retinopathy in center sparing DME, and in DME as a deferred laser to reduce the load of anti-VEGF, and in proliferative diabetic retinopathy. PDR, still we do laser, and DME in many cases to reduce the injections we do laser. These are some of the indications. Now tip 1, DME is more forgiving. There is no need to hurry. Optimal metabolic control is mandatory. Immediately tomorrow injection, no need. If suppose a patient is like this with lot of corneal spot, nephropathy, look for nephropathy, lot of lipids, just do a lipid profile and other parameters and then follow up the patient. You make sure it is not PDR. So second tip is FFA has a role in DME and severe end PDR. So you can identify the leaking microaneurysms, and your optimal laser can be very optimal. These are some of the cases pre and post treatment along with the help of FFA. So these are some of the cases. It works wonderfully well in a center sparing DME. Now tip 3, use less laser if there is a lot of fibrous tissue. The first top left is pre-treatment. With little laser itself, it has started fibrosing. Stop there. It is a surgical case. And the right one is a post-surgery picture. And tip 4, some are surgical. Don't waste your time with laser. Laser is usually worsen the condition. And the next point is don't do aggressive laser in diabetic. The disease will also behave aggressively. If you see the lower picture with the pre-retinal hemorrhage, this heavy laser 3 sittings were given within a week, and the patient came with the right side picture of a combined RD. So the disease is also behaving aggressively. So spacing with this little spacing, like little by little, you can finish the laser over a few weeks. That is always better. So now we have better laser machines like Pascal or multi-spot laser. You don't have to treat very badly, very aggressively with scarring. Now, laser is not the final answer. Importance of counseling is very important. Talk, talk, and talk. and you tell the patient if laser is not working, you may need injections and surgery, and all this has to be has to enter the patient's mind before, and it is not a magical treatment. And sometimes it can, as I showed this picture earlier, it's a bomb in the eye. After treatment, immediately within 1 or 2 weeks, it becomes hand movements and all. And targeted PRP works well, and less is better than excess. Suppose a fluorescent angiogram shows only in one area, low risk PDR, you can treat only that area. It works beautifully. So targeted PRP has a role if you pick up early. And anti-VEGF will cushion the adverse effects of heavy laser. And combo treatment has its own advantages. Like this, you do cataract surgery, give injection, then followed by laser. And at the end, you can see the right side picture. It has done very well. So combination therapy used with laser, anti-VEGF and other modalities works beautifully. So the key messages are laser stays, but anti-VEGF rocks. And counseling and communication is the key, and it is important in your treatment. Thanks for the kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mahesh. That was a very lucid presentation. I might say, to borrow from your last slide, all of us stay, but you really rocked. So that was a very nice presentation. Even if some of it was at the cost of repetition, it was well worth repeating. For the simple reason, this is more so for the beginners, it is important not to go through the motions of fundus examination. Fundus examination should be done with a purpose. And it is not like just going through the motions of fundus examination. And one of my professors used to say that in the examination of a diabetic patient, as Mahesh was emphasizing, look for diabetic retinopathy. And at the end of it, if you have to write no change or within normal limits or mild, you have to be dissatisfied. Go back again and try to see, don't miss new vessels. In fact, you should always be going with this bent of mind. Where are the new vessels? Where are the new vessels? So that kind of an intent should be there. The other important thing is not to use terms like mild, moderate, severe very loosely. It is not an estimation or an approximation based on what you perceive or feel like. It is an exact science to be inculcated by assiduous practice. So those are some of the points that Mahesh was trying to highlight. Thank you so much, Dr. Mahesh. We come to the last talk of this instruction course, which will be delivered by my dear friend, Dr. Nitin Prabhudesai. I first met Dr. Nitin Prabhudesai when he was a consultant in Shankar Netralaya, and I must say that he was my benefactor in giving me surgeries and teaching me the early baby steps. I cut my teeth in vitreoretinal surgery with him, if I might say so. Now, a brief introduction of Dr. Nitin Prabhudesai. He did his medical education, MBBS, DOMS with a gold medal, and MS from the TN Medical College, Nair Hospital, Mumbai. And then he did a vitreoretinal fellowship at Shankar Netralaya and continued there as a consultant, and later on at Shri Ganapati Netralaya in Jalna. Currently, he is the Associate Professor of Ophthalmology at the Bharati Vidyapit Medical College and the Director of Prabhudesai Eye Clinic in Pune. I have been there. It's a wonderful facility that he has. It's a division of Insight Vision Foundation. He is also the past president of the Pune Ophthalmological Society. We have great pleasure in welcoming you, Dr. Nitin, to present your talk.
Thank you, Kumar, for a very, very kind introduction. I am indebted to you for accepting me for this instruction course. Now, my previous speakers have dealt in details about diabetic retinopathy, both medical as well as surgical treatment. And in this last talk, I would like to point out the first dictum I would like to highlight is that not every retinal lesion in a person with known diabetes is diabetic retinopathy. So we have to keep our mind open. Even if the patient is diabetic for years together, he may still harbor some other comorbidity and may have that effect on the retina. So I think we have to keep an open mind and the patient was with blurred vision and he is a diabetic. My slides are not moving. 1 minute.
We have lots of time. You can settle it.
Yeah, no, my slides are not moving. I'm just checking that. Yeah. So let us look at this situation here. Now, this patient is again a known diabetic for years together, presents to you with this picture of multiple retinal hemorrhages. And looking at his status, you feel, general ophthalmologist will feel that this is a non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy with multiple hemorrhages in all quadrant, maybe a severe form. But once we investigated the patient, central systemic status, FFA, OCT, this turned out to be a non-ischemic CRVO. A patient like this who presents to you with blurred vision, hard exudate at the fovea, again, you may think that this is a diabetic maculopathy, but again, a proper examination, investigations. I can see in this slide here on the right that there is, in the FFA, you see a sectorial microvascular anomalies. This is suggestive of tributary retinal vein occlusion in the inferotemporal quadrant. A similar situation here. If you just look at the posterior pole, as has been highlighted in the earlier talks also, you would feel that this is a diabetic maculopathy with hard exudates, microaneurysms. But if you look closely at the posterior pole, you can see that there are hard exudates, but above that, there is this vein which has got occluded. Hence, this is just not a diabetic retinopathy, but a superior temporal branch vein occlusion which changes at the macula. Now, this is an interesting case. We saw this lady about 2 years before this picture, when we diagnosed her with a particular condition and advised her treatment and investigations, but she didn't follow up with us and came to us after 2 years. And when we did her angiogram, this was the picture. So if you look at this angiogram only, you would feel she's a known diabetic. So you'll feel that this is a proliferative diabetic retinopathy with extensive NVD and NVE. But actually, she was diagnosed based off hemorrhagic CRVO when we first saw her. And over the years, the CRVO developed this type of a neovascularization. Now, again, in this case, if you see, just if you have a cursory look, you will feel there is a few retinal hemorrhages around the macula, so probably a early diabetic maculopathy. But again, if you do a proper examination, investigate the patient, you see that there are a lot of microvascular anomalies in the lower half of the macula, and further the periphery, there are definitely extensive areas of capillary non-perfusion. So this is a case of inferotemporal branch retinal vein occlusion in a person who has diabetes for a long time. So I think it's very important for us not to presume that a person has, if he has some changes, it is only diabetic retinopathy. Now again, a case of a young male, about 45 years old, who had not a very good control diabetes, and he had with this picture in his right eye, some soft exudates. Again, you would think of a mild non-proliferative diabetic retinopathy. But if you look at his other eye, again, similar, lot of soft exudates, but look at the macula. There is hard exudates coming in a star fashion with some fluid in the macula. So when we investigated him, did his blood pressure, we checked his blood pressure ourselves, his blood pressure was very high. So this is a case of hypertensive retinopathy, which may come along with his diabetes. So I think systemic evaluation, and even as a ophthalmologist, you have to be very careful. Recently, I had a very young boy, 25-year-old, non-hypertensive, non-diabetic, who presented with extensive retinopathy. And his blood pressure, when we checked immediately, was something like 240/160, had to be admitted in the ICU the same day. So I think we have to be very careful and keep an open mind. So this patient presented, a known diabetic, presented with sudden loss of vision, and you can see clearly that there is a opacification of the macula, a cherry red spot. So no doubt this clinically is a central retinal artery occlusion. So these arterial occlusions can come with diabetic retinopathy, or like a branch arterial occlusion when this patient presents to you with an upper half visual loss, sudden onset. So he has a inferotemporal branch retinal artery occlusion. As mentioned earlier, if you have a patient who presents with such hard exudate, extensive hard exudate, you feel that probably he has a chronic diabetic maculopathy. But if you look closely, there is some dirty white membrane here, some fluid here. So after investigations in the form of FFA, OCT, and ICG, this turned out to be an PCV. Again, a confusing situation when you have excessive hard exudates, but they may not be typical hard exudates. They may be just reticular drusen or drusen scattered all over. And this, again, when on investigations with FFA and OCT and OCT angiography, turned out to be an early neovascularization which needed treatment. And subtle hemorrhages like this should prompt you to think not only of diabetic retinopathy, but also of retinal angiopathy or angiomatous proliferation, where you can get these small hemorrhages right at the foveal center. Again, a comorbidity which is not very common is the microaneurysms, which if you see here very clearly, and they lead to a lot of exudation. So if the microaneurysm is not very large, you may miss it, and you may just think this as a diabetic maculopathy. And again, in this extensive hard exudates, but there is a microaneurysm here which confirms the diagnosis. A patient may present with retinal hemorrhages, and you may think this is a part of his diabetic retinopathy, but you have to see closely that there are some rot spots here. And when we had him investigated, his hemoglobin was only 4, and we had to refer him to a hematologist for his treatment. So anemic retinopathy can also present in patients with diabetics, and maybe sometimes along with diabetic retinopathy. And lastly, I'll show you this case, an 8-year-old lady who came to us with blurring of vision only in the left eye. When you examined her, we saw extensive retinal hemorrhages all around, but no hard usurates, no new vessels. Her other eye didn't have much of diabetic retinopathy, so we investigated her. Had a suspicion of carotid artery occlusion, so we got her carotid angiograph, carotid Doppler also, and she turned out to be a case of ocular ischemic syndrome. So I think these all entities should be kept in mind. And in ocular ischemic syndrome, FFA plays a very important role, and that will help us differentiate from a typical diabetic NVDA or severe NPDR. So to conclude, we have to keep an open mind while examining all diabetics. A proper systemic history, appropriate investigations would lead to a proper diagnosis and treatment of comorbidities, along with treatment of diabetic or any diabetic retinopathy if needed. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Nitin Prabhudesai, for donating time to the overall discussion. Now you have finished well ahead of time, but the subject was covered very extensively, very nicely. Now, the object of including that last talk in our instruction course was not really to stimulate any exotic thinking, as it is the diagnosis, evaluation, and management of diabetic retinopathy itself is a handful. But then the important thing is these patients with diabetes mellitus also have other comorbidities, and among them, systemic hypertension is the commonest, and the commonest which is underdiagnosed or simply ignored. And this can have more effects on the patient in terms of nephropathy or a cerebrovascular accident. So it's very important not to miss associated hypertension, and many times it is the ophthalmologist who will be diagnosing this on a routine bedside blood pressure test. And that is very, very important, as Nitin was highlighting. If you see hard exudates restricted to the horizontal raphe on either above or below in what is called as the macular Japanese fan type as compared to the macular star, then you have to think more likely to be that to be a case of a branch retinal or a tributary vein occlusion. That is one thing. And of course, these patients are also prone, diabetic patients are also prone to renal involvement, anemia, etc. So those conditions can affect the retina, and they may be first to draw attention of the ophthalmologist to hitherto undiagnosed anemia or nephropathy. So that was the objective. The second important thing that we need to realize is diabetic patients are not immune to developing other diseases that may occur in the general population, such as PCV, etc., as Nitin highlighted. So with that, we have formally completed the discussion related to the set pattern of the instruction course, and we still have a lot of time to discuss some of the things that we might have missed. So if any of the panelists want to initiate a discussion on this, or if Dr. Guru Prasad wants to go back to a few slides of his, which he had to needlessly hurry through, would you be wanting to come in, Guru Prasad?
Not really. Actually, there were some examples of patients' presentations which gave us some lessons. I think a couple of them I told, but it's okay. I just want to ask a couple of questions to Dr. Purna. Dr. Purna, you said you use in a case of rebleed or a vitreous cavity hemorrhage, we call it VCH or a rebleed. You use anti-VEGF and then do a lavage. What is the role of anti-VEGF, and really does it stay in the eye, or does it really work in the eye?
Anti-VEGF only in case of anterior segment neovascular lesions, are not all VH. If there is an associated NVA or NVA, then I do inject. Of course, the wash time is faster, I do agree, but I prefer giving it. But the way I give it, whenever we give, I always prefer giving some part in anterior chamber also.
So I just want to share what I do for with rehemorrhage or rebleeds or vitreous cavity hemorrhage post-vitrectomy. What I do is I do a lavage. I look for areas of skipped areas of endolaser which can be augmented, areas that can be augmented. I do a little more vitrectomy wherever it is possible with indentation without jeopardizing the lens. I remove any fibrous tissue that might be present or which might have reproliferated. And one thing I do is to cryo the ports, cryo the area of the ports. I just want to know if everybody else has any other way of doing it. Um, and one thing about Dr. Prabhu Desai's talk, I loved it. Nice talk, Dr. Prabhu Desai. One thing we rule out in all our patients of diabetes is a myeloproliferative disorder by a simple CBC, which we have had a couple of cases in the past where, in fact, 4 cases in the last 2 years where the patient turned out to have leukemia, which he never knew, in fact. And these patients had continuous rebleed. In fact, a couple of eyes were lost due to blood at all levels, including subretinal hemorrhage as well. So I think CBC is one simple test which we can do include in our protocol of workup of these patients.
So any experience regarding the iris neovascularization causing recurrent bleeds? So a very long time back, I had heard Dr. Jovanovic saying that in one desperate case, he had even went ahead and chewed up the iris to prevent recurrent bleeds. So any role of giving anti-VEGFs in the anterior segment to control, because the iris neovascularization on the back side of the iris are not visible. And these patients, even in spite of good vitrectomy, good laser, anti-VEGF, still keep bleeding. Any experience in that part?
No, I think anti-VEGFs are now ruling the roost, and I think Jovanovic's comment might have been in an era where anti-VEGFs were really not that freely available. So chewing up the iris may be too much of an overkill in the present day. So I would like to have the thoughts of others.
Kumar, see, this neovascular glaucoma in PDR is entirely different from neovascular glaucoma in CR view, where we fight usually a losing battle. But in PDR, NVG, if you aggressively treat many cases, we can save the eye with all sort of anti-VEGF, laser, surgery, whatever, and shunt tube or shunt. So you don't waste time and then aggressively treat. Many are salvageable, little better than ischemic CR view.
So do you have any experience of using, if your patient has undergone vitrectomy, you did lavage, any experience of using silicone oil as a tamponade just to prevent a recurrent bleed?
Yes, sir. Actually, all of us do that because after one lavage, again it is bleeding in spite of giving good laser, cryo port, and then even anti-VEGF, everything. Again, it bleeds. Sometimes we, one-night patients and all, we keep oil for some time. That is, all of us do that.
I do that in all one-night patient, even if it's first episode of lavage. Actually, if it's one-night patient, I will do oil.
First time probably try with gas, but again and again it is coming. We have to take care of the patients.
Oil, it also helps for better post-operative monitoring. It also kind of compartmentalizes this VEGFs and all that. Anterior migration will also less. The other advantages are also there in the oil. At least we can sleep safely for next 6 months.
Murli has a point.
One more question in this regard.
Doctor, 1 minute. Dr. Murli has a point. He wanted to come in.
Yeah, no, I do use silicone oil as a last resort whenever patient presents with multiple recurrent post-vitrectomy vitreous hemorrhages. And I do use silicone oil, and I find it's a good tool. I leave it for at least 1 year and then remove the silicone oil in these eyes. Of course, we always supplement with an extra laser and all that in addition to that. And I have found that, somehow in that 1 year's time, the process seems to have stabilized. And after removing the oil, they have not had much rebleeds. So I think there is a role for silicone oil in recurrent. I'm not talking about the first time, the recurrent post-vitrectomy vitreous hemorrhages, silicone oil has a role.
And do you give anti-VEGF for recurrent hemorrhages? Because in a study by ASRS, they had said that some of the surgeons use multiple anti-VEGFs for recurrent vitreous hemorrhages. They don't do even lavage. They just keep giving injections.
I really don't want. Are there any, with the hall coordinator be able to tell us whether I wonder whether there's anybody really watching our instruction course?
Because, no, sir, they are there because they will be watching through the audience link, sir. Because this training will be for only us.
I got a feeling that we were veering off towards hardcore vitreoretina in our discussions in the last few minutes. So they should not be perturbed by that. So any questions or any discussions related to the basic aspects of diabetic retinopathy? As I said, the last talk was mainly to promote lateral thinking and not stifle our thinking only to diabetic retinopathy in patients of diabetes. Any other thoughts, Dr. Muralidhar or Dr. Purna, about the
No, I
first
want
part, the
to
basics
add
of
one thing, which is the hot topic of discussion: post-COVID and post-vaccination worsening. In fact, Guru Prasad showed one case, and he wanted. So what I have seen is, I do believe, and earlier, I mean, or my logical brain thought, oh, no, there should not be a correlation. There are many viral diseases which has come and gone and all that. So unless where I started seeing a cases post-infection where the antibody titers are very high, not like 500,000, where antibody titers are 5,000 and 6,000, where you screen for literally possible everything about autoimmune work up to everything, you don't find anything. In these cases, you don't have anything except to attribute it to the inflammatory factor, which can very well, I mean, cause vascular occlusions also, and existing diabetic retinopathy can also progress. So I do believe that the vaccination and this post-COVID has a role in our retinal disorders, be it any vascular retinal disorder.
Is the extrapolation is probably in COVID, post-COVID, we should use anti-VEGF little judiciously, because if they are
No, not anti-VEGFs. Actually, my case in which we started on because he had perivascular some leak also, absolutely normal anything. We started on oral steroid, it resolved. So except this 6,500 antibody level, nothing he had. Just 2 weeks of 2 to 3 tapering steroids, it all stabilized.
maybe we will learn more with time.
Yes, definitely.
Other thing which I happened to observe recently is 2 patients who had been operated for cataract elsewhere just before lockdown in March, in the early first week of April, and could not go for a follow-up. And when they went for a follow-up now, their vision was very poor, and the patient were referred to me. Both of them had only mild changes in the other eye, and this eye, the operated eye, had progressed to neovascular glaucoma. One of them was a COVID positive patient. The other didn't report any COVID, but he might well have had an asymptomatic COVID or whatever. So these 2 quick cases of 2 NVGs in the space of a week, I happened to see in the last 1 week. So that
that is this point none of us have highlighted, actually. Very important after cataract surgery, the need for retinal evaluation in a diabetic case, because it can progress dramatically in some cases. So many of them after 3-4 months, they will come with very bad retinopathy. So this point has to be highlighted, especially for general ophthalmologists who are doing cataract surgery in a diabetic patients. Good point, Kumar.
And also general ophthalmology, if there is any grade of diabetic retinopathy, if they're operating cataract, their chair time with patient has to be more. Okay, because as such diabetic retinopathy also can, I think it was highlighted, sir told one talk, and existing CME also can worsen, that we all know that.
I was specifically talking, apart from what Mahesh said, these 2, one of them was a positive COVID patient, and the other one, there was no report of any COVID. So I was trying to allude to the COVID situation, where these thrombotic tendencies seem to be higher. Just 2 patients, but then just a thought, just a hypothesis.
But only that eye worsened, right? Other eye did not worsen. So it cannot be related to COVID. Maybe related to dramatic worsening after cataract surgery, which we see in diabetic retinopathy.
Right.
One more point we tell the comprehensive ophthalmologists that most of them have OCT. So all diabetics, we advise them, even if they don't see any obvious diabetic retinopathy, to have a pre-operative OCT for cataracts if the cataract is not dense enough. Because many times small cystic changes, ERMs can be missed, and the patient would be very unhappy post-surgery. And as I said, sometimes it can worsen. So they'll have to take appropriate action before the cataract surgery.
Yeah, so, in the previous instruction course, Nitin, to allude to buttress your point, in fact, not only why just diabetic patients, all patients scheduled for cataract surgery now, it has now become the dictum that they undergo a preoperative OCT scan, because many pathologies may be invisible to the best trained human eye. So that should be part and parcel of it. Guru Prasad and Muralidhar, you've been very quiet. Any 2 parting comments?
Thank you, Kumar. It was a lovely IC, and the discussion also went very, very well. About the trimming, Purna, I just want to ask you whether you trim or you remove the fibrous tissue from the disc. I think I like to remove as long as it is not so traumatic to the nerve fiber layer, because I believe that if you leave it, it might cause reproliferation. and that can cause peripapillary traction and again striae around the macula. So I like to remove whenever it is not so difficult to remove.
No, I prefer removing, sir. But always, if you know, like if you put up this topic in a hardcore retina meeting, there is always for and against. I personally prefer removal. Bleeding, it's okay. Let there be blood clot, it clots, it will go away. Once you make sure that all the hyaloid is gone, bleeding, I'm not much worried. But even if the little stump, if we leave, it will eventually come with the papillomacular bundle contract, that the skytic-like changes and all that. Patient will have some permanent anatomic damage in that. So
Murli must have done a lot of vitropapillary traction cases. I think he would probably be knowing
this is
about
one thing
the
which is
damage to nerve fiber layer and the field defects that ensue.
See, regarding the removal versus leaving the stump, we all get probably chastened by our experiences. So if you have tried to pull and remove a stump and then stuck with the bleeding, then the next few cases probably you say, no, I'm not going to remove this stump. I'm going to just trim this and leave it there. So I'm only worried about the uncontrollable hemorrhage that occurs when you pull off the proliferation from the disc. So if you feel that the risk of hemorrhage is greater, then I would like to leave it in place and just trim it. And if I feel that the risk of hemorrhage is not much, I would like to pull it off. I would like to pull it off, but sometimes I am hesitant to do so because of the fear of hemorrhage. And I think this is one aspect where not much work is done. Is really leaving the stump is really going to cause any long-term effects? I'm not very sure. I know, although Purnachandra alluded to the fact that the stump can kind of get attached to papillomacular bundle and all that, we don't have really evidence to say that which is better. So at the moment, it left the surgeons, I would say, heroics or how brave he is, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's better to use the adage of discretion is the better part of valor and settle for a good result rather than going for the best result, because the best can many times be the enemy of the good. So settle for a good result.
We're out of time, I think.
Yeah, we have to wind up, Kumar.
Thank you.
Thank
Kumar
all
Thank you so much, all the
for this
doctors, the
instruction.
respected chairperson, K.S. Kumar, and all the renowned speakers. Thank you so much for being the part of this session.
My heartfelt thanks to all my co-instructors. If I forget to send a thank you note on the WhatsApp, I'm using this forum to thank you once again. Thank you very much. Well done.
And thanks to hall coordinator also for coordinating.
Thanks the hall
Thank you
coordinator
so
too.
much.
Thanks Tanvi. Thank you.
Yeah, have a nice day ahead.
Same to you. Thank you. Bye everybody.